you want to sit down for a minute? Because obviously Lauren will say a few words. Okay. As well. Just to give you some power in your legs. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this esteemed inaugural professorial lecture this evening. So it's wonderful to see so many colleagues here. I know Jane is really competing with the weather and the thought of barbecues or al fresco sitting in the garden. So such a great turnout here in person, and to colleagues and friends and collaborators nationally and internationally online. It's really great to welcome you all here this evening. Inaugural professorial is a couple of really important aspects of this evening. First of all, it's to really celebrate the achievements of a fantastic colleague who has achieved so much already in their academic career. But also to learn, be inspired, question, challenge everything we're about to hear. 3 years ago, I think Jane came along to the 3 or 4, because we had COVID and we were never sure whether we were on campus or off. But I'd asked Jane to come along and give a few words about her research journey at our annual PGR conference, PhD conference, student conference, and it was truly inspirational. Everybody was moved and inspired in the room, so I've no doubt we're in for a treat this evening. So as academics at ARU, we try to live by our vision and our mission, which is to transform lives through innovative, inclusive and entrepreneurial education and research. And Jane indeed is someone that works right across that spectrum in really impactful ways. So Jane develops, delivers, inspires the course content around the areas of psychology that she teaches, looks after students in terms of PGR students, indeed was acknowledged as an outstanding Vice-Chancellor's PhD supervisor in the special awards 2 years ago. But also in terms of that teaching as research-led from an area that Jane has really been preeminent and really defined her own leadership nationally and internationally, and I think we'll hear a blend of those two. And then on the transforming lives thing, I think equally important, Jane takes really great care, not just of her students, but also the colleagues around her, and she's taken extra time to support and listen to the voice of colleagues and be a really terrific, really pragmatic and constructive representative of colleagues' views and so on as well. And I think, that's a really, really important dimension to play, really excellent citizenship to the institution. So I won't keep you any more from a more formal introduction, other than I really do hope you enjoy yourselves this evening. And if Jane is good enough, I'd be happy to facilitate some questions and answers after her talk. So do please enjoy yourselves this evening. And I'll hand over to Professor Laurie Butler.
Deputy Vice-Chancellor, thank you very much for that, and good evening. Welcome to Anglo-Ruskin University. Welcome to our inaugural lecture this evening. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce the speaker for tonight's inaugural lecture. So let me just give you a little bit of background. So Jane is Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Anglo-Ruskin University, where she leads the Self and Body Lab. She's currently the lead for postgraduate research in the School of Psychology, Sport and Sensory Sciences, and a unit assessment convener for the Research Excellence Framework. As Yvonne just mentioned, Jane's research has been recently recognised in 2 ways, so 2 different Vice-Chancellor's Awards. So one for outstanding research, Jane's work in her own right, and one for outstanding doctoral supervision, that care and attention and support for our next generation of research, which of course is so important. Now, before working at ARU, Jane did postdoctoral research at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland, at Goldsmiths College in London, and at the University of Oxford. She completed her MRC-funded PhD in neuroscience at the University of Newcastle, and for her undergraduate studies, she read biological sciences at the University of Oxford. Her programme of research spans investigations into the bodily basis of self in neurotypical and autistic people, and in people living with chronic pain and depersonalisation. Her lab also investigates the brain's processing of internal body signals, interoception, in autism, chronic pain, and in many aspects of cognition. Now, Jane has held roles in international societies, including the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness and the Body Representation Network. She serves on a BBSRC research committee and on the pool of experts for versus arthritis and on the editorial boards of 2 journals. Jane is passionate about public engagement with science. She regularly gives talks at events such as the British Science Festival, the Chelmsford Science Festival and the Cambridge Festival, and her research findings have received international media attention. Jane is currently, in her spare time, outside of all of that, writing a popular science book about the brain bases of self for Harvard University Press. So, in her talk this evening, Jane will share insights from 20 years of research into the self. She will argue that the self is grounded in the brain's model of the body, that the physical self is the foundation for the mental self. Jane will discuss how disturbed interactions between the body and brain give rise to disorders of self, including some types of chronic pain and out-of-body experiences. And she will show how these can be investigated using virtual reality body illusions. And I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's going to be an absolutely fantastic talk. So, with a talk titled, Finding the Self in the Brain, Why the Body Matters for Mind, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Jane Aspell.
Thank you so much, Yvonne and Laurie, for that kind introduction. Thank all of you so much for coming today. It really means a great deal to have your support and everyone online as well. It's really a lovely moment to give this kind of lecture and give an overview of research that I've been doing for about 19 years. I can't quite believe it's that long. So hopefully you'll learn something about yourself today and how your body is extremely important. So as this is an inaugural lecture, I'll start off telling you a little bit about the path that I took to becoming professor. So we'll go back quite close to the beginning of myself. So you probably won't be able to tell from my accent, but I grew up in Wales, in South Wales, in Swansea Valley, and to be very exact, in Cwmtwrch, which was a small village not far from the Brecon Beacons near the Black Mountains. That's me in my traditional Welsh costume that we all wore every St David's Day to school. I grew up in the 1980s during the miners' strikes under a Thatcherite government. And those of you who know of my trade union activism might see where the seeds were planted in those years. So I grew up in a really beautiful part of the world, in the countryside. I'm an only child. There weren't many other children in my village. And I spent a great deal of time with my dog, walking in the woods and in the mountains. And I developed a really deep love of nature. And I was also interested in science from a young age and spent a lot of time in the local libraries. So I think, due to those things, I particularly grew to love biology. So after school, I went to Oxford University, to Somerville College, and did a degree in biological sciences. And it's quite a broad degree, so I studied everything from plants to insects to evolution. And I did one module on comparative neurobiology. And I think we had one single lecture on the human brain during my degree. But from that, and also from a lot of reading that I did in philosophy of mind and onto neuroscience, I realized that I wanted to become a scientist and particularly to investigate the human brain. So after my degree, I went up to Newcastle, which was quite a different city, certainly more and better nightclubs. And I did my PhD there under Anya Hilbert, who was a really wonderful supervisor, and she is still, for me, a role model of a brilliant scientist and a person really of huge generosity and integrity. So I was really lucky to have her. And I was studying the human brain, and in particular how the human brain processes signals from our vision, from our eyes, and also how the brain is able to bring together and integrate information from different senses, so in particular from vision and from hearing. So I did quite a lot of behavioural experiments and also brain imaging experiments. So I spent quite a bit of time as well over in Helsinki in Finland, because they had, at the time, quite cutting-edge technology there, a type of brain imaging scanner called magnetoencephalography, and you can see me there in the scanner. It looks like one of those old-fashioned hair dryers that old ladies used to sit under. I spent far too many hours sitting there, measuring the very tiny magnetic fields that the brain produces all of the time, and trying to understand how the brain is bringing together these different sources of sensory information. And after my PhD, I went back to Oxford for a few years to Oliver Braddock's lab and learnt how to do another imaging method, which is fMRI, still looking at vision. But I started to realise that it wasn't quite the area for me. So it took time, I think, to realise exactly what research questions would really, really drive my passion. And I think, again, from my reading into philosophy and reading books by Antonio Damasio and people like that, I really wanted to investigate consciousness in particular, how our brain creates our sense of self. So I did a brief postdoc at Goldsmiths in London, but it was when I went over to Switzerland to the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, one of the Swiss federal institutes on the lovely shores of Lake Geneva, and I joined Olaf Blanke's lab. And that was an amazing opportunity, because at the time his lab was one of the few labs in the world that was studying the neuroscientific basis of self. So he had some incredible resources there, an international research group, and he's also a pioneer of studying out-of-body experiences. So it's there that I really found my passion, and some of the work that I'll talk about today was completed while I was in that lab. After EPFL, then I got my job at AIU. So that was already 14 years ago. And I've been working on this topic of the self ever since, building my own research group. And so that's sort of a quick summary of how I got to be here. So the topic that I'm studying is something, of course, that we all have our own intimate knowledge of. Each of us has a self. And so we all have our own lifelong experience and expertise actually on this topic. And that experience is an essential part of the research. In fact, that experience is what I'm trying to understand and explain. But if I ask you to try and think about what a self is and to define a self, you might find it's a little bit difficult. And if you perhaps read books or articles from different authors, you'll find that people define the self in very different ways. And that is because, well, partly because the self is a really complex phenomenon. It has many different facets and components. And one question is how they relate to each other. So normally, if you think about the self, you might think about, of course, your personality, so the kind of person that you are, your personal identity. But this, I would say, is the highest level of self. It requires language, concepts, memory. It takes many years to develop. But as a biologist, I'm interested in sort of what comes before that. Is this something more foundational in terms of evolution and in terms of biological development that might provide the foundation for those highest levels of self? So we can try and think about simpler forms of self, perhaps. What about the self as an entity that persists over time and that seems to be continuous with an entity that was conscious at previous times? So I feel like the same person today who went to bed last night. I feel like the same person today as I did 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. And you probably feel the same. So there is that sense of continuity, isn't there? A persistence of the same self, which exists across many different periods of time. And of course, that couldn't exist without memory. So the self is also an entity able to recall memories of its previous existence and also use those to predict and plan and imagine its own future. But as scientists, we often like to reduce things, don't we? We want to find the simplest form of something that might perhaps underlie those more complex manifestations of it. And what philosophers have come up with as the simplest form of self that they think could exist, and I agree with, is the self as the subject of conscious experience. The experiencer, to whom and for whom things happen. So if you think of all the different conscious experiences you could have, the experience of hearing my voice, of smelling coffee, of feeling anxious, of thinking about where you'll go on holiday, of hearing a car alarm. So we have this massive variety of conscious experiences. But what unites them all is that there is always someone having that experience. There is always an experiencer. And I don't think consciousness could exist without there being an experiencer. And that is the simplest form of self, I think, that can exist. It exists in extremely young human beings, probably in many non-human animals as well. But the question is then, for me, how does the brain create this experience of being a subject, of being a self? And this, I think, is the aspect of self which is foundational for all those higher levels of self. So you can think of the self, I suppose, as an onion that's got these different layers, but they relate to each other, so they're not all kind of independent. At some point, you have to come to a foundational level, something that is the core and the foundation, the bedrock of selfhood, upon which these other layers then are built. So it's a difficult question to investigate. It's something that philosophers have been thinking about for many centuries, but scientists have only quite recently, in the last 20, 30 years maybe, really started making progress into this. How can you even start to investigate it? Well, you might think about, well, when does a self develop, perhaps, in a human life? And this is a hard thing to investigate as well. So if you are going to look at very young children who can't answer questionnaires or tell you about their experience of the self, how could you do this? So one way to do this is to look at self-recognition, to use what's called the mirror self-recognition task. If you place a little mark on a baby's face without it realizing, show it a mirror, and then see how it behaves if it realizes that that image in the mirror relates to its own body. And babies can pass this test at about 18 months old. Not to say that there was no self before then, but this is one marker of self-awareness. And this has been used in non-human animals as well. Not all, of course, but the ones that have passed the test, you might not be surprised to hear, are chimpanzees, elephants, dolphins, the cleaner wrasse fish, a ghost crab, and a magpie, a very intelligent bird you probably see in your garden. So it's about 18 months in children, but going back even earlier in life, there have been studies as well on newborns to see what kind of experience of their body and their self that they might have. So I don't know how they persuaded newborns to come into the lab, but they probably went to the hospital to test them, I imagine. So what they did was they had a paintbrush and tapped the baby's cheek, which was literally a few hours old, and then they showed the baby two videos, one in which there was a baby's face that was being tapped exactly in synchrony with the actual baby's face, and then another video where they saw a baby's face being tapped, but it was not at the same time as their own face was being tapped. And babies were able to discriminate between those videos. They looked longer at the video which showed the tapping, which was sort of like a mirror, where the tapping was synchronous, even at just a few hours old. So that shows that even at that age, just being born, their brains were able to bring together information from multiple senses that related to their body. And this is the key thing, I think, for building a sense of self. So our brains have maps of our bodies within it. And we've known this for over 100 years. They actually managed to map out exactly which part of the brain responds to different parts of the body. And this is the same for every individual. So we know exactly where in the brain, which part of the brain receives touches from your hand or your face or your leg. And there's another map which controls different parts of the body. So we know exactly where the neurons are that make your hand move or your leg move or your lips move. These are just two of the maps of the body and the brain, but there are many, many maps of the body in the brain that map different aspects of our bodies. And that's what your brain has to figure out first of all. So before you can develop any kind of personality or personal identity, first thing the brain has to figure out is, what in the world is my physical self? Where is the boundary between me and the rest of the world? And that is something we take for granted, but it's something the brain has to figure out. So the theory that I've been looking at for all these years is the idea that first of all, our brain develops a map or a model of our physical self, the body, and then upon that foundation is built a model which is the experience of our mental self. But how could we test this? And we can look at this experience of the self as it relates to the body. So at the most basic level, you are a body, you are a physical thing. But this experience that we have of our body has different components. Again, things we take for granted. We all feel the ownership for a body. So I feel this is my body. We have the sense of being able to control a body. We have the experience of seeing the world from the perspective of that body. And we also have the experience of seeming to be located within a body. And that is what we call the experience of the bodily self. And that is what I think is the foundational level of self, upon which all the other levels of self are then built. To investigate, there are different approaches to investigate this. So one way is to look at conditions in which the experience of self is radically altered. So these are sort of natural experiments in a way. Often in science, you want to try and, if you want to try and understand something, you can sort of look at it in a sense in the kind of abnormal form. So out-of-body experiences have been studied by scientists in the last sort of 20 or 30 years. Olaf Blanke is one of the key scientists who worked on this. And these are very strange conditions, temporary experiences, where somebody feels that the self comes out of the body, is no longer located in the body, and seems to float above the body and look down on it. And these are very, very realistic seeming experiences. They are very real to the person who has them. And they do vary from person to person, but all out-of-body experiences have certain things in common, and in particular, there is always this experience that the self is located in one place, but the body in another. And in a sense, there is an experience now, not of one self, but of two selves. The self up at the ceiling, and then the self, which is the body lying below. So there's a sort of there's been a kind of disconnection, a dissociation, and a duplication, in a sense, of the self. And often the body and the world are seen below one. So these, of course, are very complicated hallucinations. And scientists have started to understand why they occur, and because they are a very strange manifestation of self, they can tell us something about how the brain creates a sense of self, even in healthy people. And what Olaf Blanke in Switzerland and other scientists have found over the years is that there's actually one particular part of the brain that you can see here on the rotating skull. It's called the temporoparietal junction, which when it is not functioning correctly because of epilepsy, migraine, taking certain drugs, a lack of oxygen, brain tumours, this then can cause an out-of-body experience to occur. So why is that particular part of the brain causing this experience to happen? So in the temporoparietal junction, you have, again, maps of the body, and they are multisensory maps. So this area of the brain receives information from multiple different senses, from vision, from touch, from the balance system, and it combines them together to give rise, usually, to our ordinary experience of being oneself and a self that seems to be located in the body. Now, when that integration doesn't happen correctly because of epilepsy, migraine, etc., the integration of the signals doesn't occur as it should, and instead of experiencing one body, one self in one body, you experience two selves and a self outside of the body. So these are interesting things, I think, to study for their own sake, but they also shed light then on what a bodily self is and how the brain creates a bodily self. They show that these different components of the self can come apart. So it is possible to feel like your self is not located in your body. it is possible to feel ownership for more than one body, more than oneself at the same time, and to have these very bizarre changes in first-person perspective. And what I've been looking at, the components of bodily self in particular, in my work, have been this experience of owning, of having a body, and also the experience of the self being within the body. And these are really weird things, aren't they? They aren't things that you normally think about. You just open your eyes and there is the experience. But of course, all this relies on very complicated processing by our brains. The problem with out-of-body experiences for scientists is they are quite rare. And of course, it's rarer still for someone to have them when there's a scientist around to measure something. So a great way to try and study this then would be if you could somehow induce an out-of-body experience in a healthy person in a non-dangerous way. And that's what Olaf Blanker in his lab in Switzerland was able to do. So he created, with Binia Lengenhager, this experimental paradigm with healthy people called a virtual out-of-body experience. So this requires people to come into the lab. They wear a virtual reality headset that's connected to a camera standing behind them. So then when they put the VR headset on, they have this really strange experience of seeming to stand behind themselves. So you have the sense of being located sort of outside of your body. So it is similar to an out-of-body experience. And then at the same time, you have an experimenter tapping the person on the back. Oh, something's happened. What happened? My monitor's gone off. Gone to sleep. I'll be back with you. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, so you have this really strange experience then of standing behind yourself. The experimenter taps you on the back. You feel the touches on your back while you're seeing yourself over there being tapped on the back. So yeah, this causes the illusion then to become stronger. And you're able to measure the effects of this. You can quantify it. So people experience, after even just a minute of this illusion, that their self is no longer located in their body. And this change in self-location is greater when the taps are synchronous with what you feel. And also there's a change in body ownership. So you feel like that virtual body is more like you, is more part of you, is you, again, when those taps that you feel are in sync with the taps that you see on the virtual body. So we've used this experimental paradigm in many different studies, in my lab and also in other labs. And I've got a little video of it, of one of the studies that we did back in 2009.
This man could be about to have an out-of-body experience using a new lab technique. A series of lights attached to vibrators were taped to his back, and a camera was positioned to film him from behind. By donning a headset, he'll be able to watch the footage of himself in real time, projected 2 meters in front of him. He's told to ignore any flashing lights he sees and to use a hand sensor to report where he feels vibrations. The experiment started with someone stroking his back to try and induce the out-of-body experience. The man then started to feel vibrations and see flashing lights, which were not always in sync. In some cases, watching the lights caused people to incorrectly report where they felt vibrations. These people also felt that their virtual self in the video was being touched. After the experiment, volunteers were moved backwards and then asked to go back to where they were standing. Those that had felt an out-of-body experience would walk further forward, closer to where they had seen the projection. The technique could be used in video games to make you feel like you are your avatar.
So it doesn't require any really fancy VR, actually. It's quite a kind of basic setup, but it causes quite profound changes in your experience of self. So we've used these sort of virtual OBE studies in many different experiments to try and understand more about how that experience of the bodily self arises. So how is the brain using the integration of multiple sensory signals in order to give rise to this foundational level of self? So I've done several studies over the years looking at how different sensory information is used. So for example, information from the sense of touch, from proprioception, which is the experience of where our joints are located in space and how that's combined with visual information. We've also done studies measuring brain activity during the illusion and see how that is altered at the same time that somebody is experiencing these changes to their self. We managed to show as well that people can experience having multiple bodies at the same time. So it's a little bit sci-fi. And of course, this does relate to people who work in virtual reality and want to sort of increase that sense of presence, of being the avatar, of being embedded in the game. It's also a nice paradigm to use to try and investigate how the bodily self develops in children. So I ran a study with a friend and colleague, Dorothy Cowie, based at Durham, to see whether children were responsive to this kind of illusion. And what we found by testing this illusion in children was that it actually takes many years for the bodily self and for multisensory integration to fully mature, to be adult-like. PhD work by Carolina Mull, who's in the audience somewhere. She looked at the bodily self in autistic participants. So she did tested the illusion in a group of autistic participants, comparing this to how neurotypical participants responded. And she found that people with autism don't experience the illusion at all. So they have no experience of self-location shifting. They don't feel like the virtual body is their body. And this, we think, is due to differences in how their brains integrate signals from different senses. And in a sense, their bodily self is sort of less plastic. It's less malleable. It's less open to change, perhaps, than the bodily selves of neurotypical people. So these many studies using these kind of OBE illusions have been able to show how the integration of multisensory signals then gives rise to our experience that my body is my body, that myself seems to be located in my body. So basically, instead of having an out-of-body experience, you can confuse the brain in the way that it integrates these multisensory signals and then give rise to the experience that you have more than one self, more than one body. So all of these studies so far have been especially looking at how signals from sort of the external body are processed and integrated, so from vision, from touch. But I became really interested, partly from reading books by Antonio Damasio, who came up with these really pioneering theories from work that he'd done with neurological patients about the importance of the internal body in the experience of self. And most of the information that our brains get from our bodies is not from our skin or from the outside of our bodies, it's actually from the inside of the body. If you think about all the different organs, of course, your heart, your lungs, your bladder, your gut, but also the metabolic processes, the physiological processes that are keeping you alive. All of those processes send signals to the brain. The brain has to monitor them to ensure that they stay within certain ranges. So your heart can't beat too fast or too slow, your blood pressure can't go too high or too low, your electrolyte levels, all these different physiological processes have to be kept within small ranges for you to stay alive. So there's this constant, enormous two-way transfer of information between the brain and the inside of the body. And so we have multiple maps in our brain again, which represent and model and keep monitoring all of these internal body signals. And because they are life-sustaining, because they are there from the beginning, it makes sense that perhaps the brain's maps of these internal body signals might be the most important of all. But how can we test what at least sound like plausible theories? So we developed another, perhaps even stranger illusion, where we thought, if it is true that these internal signals, for example, from the heart, are important for our experience of self, it should be possible to use them, again, to alter the experience of self. So we developed this other cardiac illusion. We had a half-naked man again, who was standing in a Swiss lab, wearing a VR headset, and at the same time we recorded his heartbeats. And then we had software that was able to create this silhouette, sort of like a ready bright glow, that flashed in time with his heartbeat. And in some conditions it was in time with the heartbeat, and in other conditions it was flashing but out of time. And we had another controlled comparison condition in which he saw, instead of his body, he saw an object that was flashing in time with his body. So this seemed a bit kind of crazy. We weren't sure it would work at all. Would the brain even detect the fact that this flashing body was linked to the timing of the person's own heartbeat? People couldn't consciously discriminate between them, so they didn't know when it was flashing in time and when it was flashing out of time. But it did have impacts on their experience of their self. So the brain is able to detect the fact that an external entity is changing in a way that relates to the heart. So we found that this illusion, once again, causes people to experience their self outside of their body, and that shift is greater when the flashing is in time with the heartbeat. It also causes them to feel like the virtual body is more like their body, again, when the flashing is in time with the heartbeat, even though they consciously aren't able to tell you the difference between the conditions. And when we measured brain activity during the illusion, we found certain brain areas whose activity correlated very well with the strength of the illusion. So what these different experiments show is that the bodily self is not really fixed. So it's not as if when you're a baby, your brain figures out, okay, this is me, that's the rest of the world, and that's it. No, it has to figure that out every single moment that we are alive. It is dynamic, it is plastic, it must repeatedly determine the boundary between self and world amidst constantly changing multisensory input. And because of that, you can sometimes sort of trick the brain with these illusions, and again, the boundary between self and world can be sort of affected, again, of course, if some brain areas are not functioning correctly, as in out-of-body experiences. So I became really interested in pursuing more studies on the brain's processing of these internal signals, which is something that scientists call interoception. It's an area that's been growing hugely in the last sort of 15 years or so. And there's been hundreds of studies now by all the different labs around the world showing that the way that the brain processes, integrates, and interprets signals from inside our bodies are really important for many aspects of behavior. It is involved in many different mental health conditions, everything that you test pretty much, different physical conditions as well. So the way that, how sensitive our brains are to these internal body signals is hugely important. Most of the work on interoception is focused on the heart in particular, mainly because it's very easy, of course, to measure the activity of the heart and then to try and understand, well, how accurately is the brain representing the heart? How accurate are those maps of the heart in the brain? How good are different people at detecting and sensing and perceiving their own heartbeats? So let's see how good you are. So what we often do is we get people to come into the lab and we ask them to try and perceive and count their own heartbeats, for example. So I want you to try just for a few seconds. Don't feel your pulse, that's really important. I want you to try and feel your heart beating inside your own chest. Or maybe you can feel a pulse somewhere else, but don't use your fingers. Just try and tune in to any sensation which you think might correspond to your own heartbeat. And every time there is a heartbeat, try and count it. So we'll start now. And stop. So hands up if you think you thought you could count your heartbeats. Quite a few of you. So obviously I can't verify right now if you are correct or not. Of course, if you've been running up the stairs or if you're feeling very nervous or angry, your heart pounds much more obviously, doesn't it? But if you're just sitting quietly, the sensation of the heartbeat is very weak and might not be perceptible at all. So what we need to do, of course, is to get people into the lab and, for example, record their heartbeat with a smartwatch or with ECG and see how many heartbeats that they are having within a certain period of time. So let's say they had 35, but they told me they only counted 28. So you can really quantify how good somebody is at detecting their own heartbeat. And there's been loads of studies on this using different kinds of lab methods. And it seems like actually only about a third of people are consistently good at detecting accurately their hearts beating. But of course, it's something that will vary throughout the day and for various circumstances. So we've done a number of studies in the lab looking at interoception, particularly at heartbeat detection, how it relates to different behaviours and different conditions. And Carolina Mull, again in her PhD work on autism, she investigated differences in interoception between autistic participants and neurotypical participants using heartbeat detection tasks and also using questionnaires, asking them how able they are to, for example, be aware that they are thirsty or hungry or of other kinds of body sensations. And overall, people with autism seem to be less good at being aware of these internal body sensations, and that might relate to some differences in emotional self-awareness as well. In a different PhD, this was work by Jennifer Todd, she did a whole series of studies looking at interactions between interoception and body image. So body image is, in a sense, a perception of our external body, but it particularly relates to how we feel and believe and our attitudes towards our body. So, of course, you think about body image in terms of usually negative body image, so feeling that you aren't pretty enough or slim enough. So we wondered whether there might be some kind of balance. So if perhaps somebody is less attuned to their inner body, might they be more affected by perhaps societal demands or peer pressure and so on about how they should look? Might they be paying more attention to that? And that is what she found, that interaction. So people who are more interoceptively aware are less likely to have negative body image. She did one lab study in particular looking at the gut-brain connection and how that interacts with body image. Now, our stomachs and our brains are constantly talking to each other, whether we're hungry or not. So there's a constant two-way communication between these organs. Even when your stomach is empty, it constantly sends this slow wave of activity to the brain. But this coupling, this connection between the heart and the stomach, between the brain and the stomach, varies between different individuals. So some people have a sort of stronger interaction. You could say that the map of the stomach is somehow more robust in some people than others. So we wondered again if there might be an interaction between, I suppose, how salient and robust that representation of the internal body is and the relation to body image. So to test this in the lab, Jenny measured people's brain activity at the same time as measuring the activity of their stomach, the muscular contractions. And you're able then to see whether the activity of the brain, how modulated it is by the activity of the stomach. So you can see the strength of the connection between the organs. And we were quite amazed to find that there were very strong correlations, actually, between negative body image being linked to a weaker connection between the stomach and the brain. So the weaker your representation of your internal self is, the more likely you are to have a sort of negative experience of your external self. And she found that also measuring the link between the heart and the brain, the same pattern. So the weaker the connection between the heart and the brain, the more negative somebody felt about their own body image. And then in her postdoctoral work, which was funded by Versus Arthritis, Jenny looked at interoception in chronic pain, so testing people with the condition fibromyalgia, which is an experience of all-over pain, which is very difficult to treat. And we found that people with fibromyalgia are actually better at detecting their heartbeats than pain-free individuals, and that might relate as well to some of their symptoms and perhaps spending a lot of time paying attention to painful body sensations. So these are, starting to give us answers. Of course, all these studies raise more questions than they answer. But the question is, are there any applications that derive from them? So I had an undergraduate student, James Pamment, and he wondered whether we might be able to use these OBE illusions to help people. So he had an interest in chronic pain. And what he did as part of his undergraduate project was measure so give the out-of-body illusion where people saw themselves from the outside to people who have chronic pain conditions, and after just 2 minutes of this illusion, their pain intensity dropped by about 40%. Now that's like a good analgesic drug. But we only measured pain immediately before and after the illusion. So in order to develop that perhaps into some kind of intervention, we want to know how long, might it be that drop in pain lasts longer? So if it lasts even for a few hours, then that might have promise then for developing into some kind of intervention. So we got funding from Versus Arthritis to look into this further. And in this case, we used the heartbeat illusion in people with fibromyalgia, this all over body pain. And we got people to view themselves with a virtual reality headset, and the image of their body flashed in time with their own heartbeat. We tested out different durations because we weren't sure how long it should be to give the best effect. And we also tested how long-lasting the reduction in pain intensity might be. So this is pretty new work, and we found that the best duration to use of the illusion is 12 minutes, so not too long. Pain relief was maintained actually for 24 hours, and there was a relation between how strong you experienced the illusion and how much pain intensity reduced. So we're hoping to get more money to do clinical trials and perhaps eventually develop some kind of at-home intervention that could be used for this condition, because it's actually really difficult to treat. So we do have some evidence then already, I think, but this is early days. This is new research between the link between the body and the self. So there is evidence then, I think, that the model, the physical self, is providing the foundation for the mental self. But is there a problem with this, in the fact that we are not the same physical self throughout our life? This is me about 40 years ago, before colour photography was invented in Wales. And this is me about 15 years ago. So it's clear I had a different body in those days, and our bodies change. Our physical self undergoes dramatic changes through the course of our life, not just at a sort of macro level, but we know that over a few years, every single atom in your body is replaced. In order to keep us alive, we have all these little machines that are constantly renewing our proteins. Everything breaks down, and all the atoms that comprise you today are different from the atoms that comprised you even just a few years ago. So there's a complete replacement of you over your life. So the question then is, what enables psychological continuity in your life, a continuity in personal identity, in the absence of physical continuity? So you're not the same body throughout your life. And the research I've been doing so far has really looked at how the self is created, I suppose, in each moment. But how are those different moments connected to give rise to our sense of personal identity across time? And of course, what we need to connect all these moments of self is a thread of memory. And so there must be interactions between the bodily self and memory, but this is something that hasn't really been researched very much until very recently. So in work that I've been doing with Peter Bright and based on the PhD work of Utkarsh Gupta, who I think is online in the States at the moment, so he's looked at interactions between the bodily self and memory. And in a series of studies, what he did, he got people to experience, in a sense, being a child again, having the body of the child using a virtual reality body illusion. And then afterwards, he did quite a lengthy autobiographical memory interview to see whether this experience of having a child's body again would enable somebody to access more memories. And in fact, that is what he found. So people were able to recall and access more memories from their childhood after they had this experience of being in a child's body again. So what we've seen today, I hope I've convinced you that the bodily self is something that is there from the beginning of life. But what about the end of life? What about cases in which people have dementia? So you might have friends or family in stages of dementia where often people say it feels like the person isn't there anymore because they can't remember anything that's happened in their lives. So is it true that their self has completely gone even in these late stages of dementia? I think this video shows that it's not. So even though she had lost probably all memory of dancing as a ballerina, as a young woman, she still had the memory in her body. And even though we can't all be ballerinas or elite athletes, we all have our own idiosyncratic ways of being in the world, of moving our body, of interacting with doors. We all have a particular way of getting out of bed, of lifting up a coffee cup. And these ways of being in the world, these ways of being a body, are part of ourself. And this is still there, even after all sense of personal identity might be gone, the bodily self remains. And that, of course, is because the areas of the brain that contain these memories, these procedural motor memories, are not or much less affected by the pathology of most dementias. So the bodily self then is the first self to arise in human life, and it's the last aspect of self to remain even in the late stages of dementia at the end of life. So yes, I hope that's made you think a little bit differently about yourself and about your body. I've worked with many people on this and other studies I didn't have time to talk about, and I have to really thank and acknowledge them, all the different people who've worked in my lab, different students and early career researchers, and it's just been a real privilege to see them develop and to go on to do great things, and just their enthusiasm, their ideas and their intelligence has really taught me a lot more, I think, than I kind of taught them. I also thank all the external collaborators who I've learned so much about, including collaborators within AIU and many other colleagues within AIU who I've worked with in other roles as a academic here. So grateful to my funders, and of course really grateful to friends and family, especially my parents who always believed in me and who gave me a sense of self-belief, which is so important, I think, in life in general. And last of all, thanks to my daughter, Isabel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Jane. That was incredible. You took us through what is a really complex bodily self phenomena in the way that you used that analogy at the beginning about the layers of an onion. You sort of forensically took us step by step through and produced something that was really accessible and really informative and really thought-provoking. So thank you very much. That's a real skill and a real talent. As ever, when we have experts talking about those areas that are passionate, which they leap out of bed to work on every day, it always instills a number of questions, challenges, thoughts in our audience. So I think Jane is really happy to take a few questions now and afterwards continue the conversation. So do we have any questions? I think we've got one gentleman here. Thank you.
Do you do research about... Sorry. My question is about the temporal partial junction, which is it's the same for the overbody experience. Do you do research about near-death experience and terminal lucidity as well?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've seen the one with Alzheimer, I think, with dementia. But with the terminal lucidity, sometimes their conscious, they come back, so their memory, they come back actually, and they start to know everything. Do you do this kind of research in the university? Because I believe it's the same area with the overbody experience.
Yeah, I don't personally do that kind of research on the temporoparietal junction in people in near-death experiences. There have been some recent studies, that do show that the temporoparietal junction is involved. So, the near-death experiences that probably you've heard of, that people, for example, see a light, they feel like they're rushing towards it, they might have a life review, they might feel like they're meeting relatives, they might have the out-of-body experience as part of the near-death experience. And one thing that happens that we've found out recently, not me, but other scientists, is that during that period where somebody's heart has stopped, so obviously then their heart has restarted, and then they can tell you kind of what they experienced. So when the heart is stopped and the oxygen is no longer going to the brain, this then causes a whole cascade of things to happen in the brain. So there's actually a massive release of neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine and other neurotransmitters that we think particularly affect the temporoparietal junction and cause many of the aspects of feeling calm and affecting the memory areas and things like that. So there is research into that. I don't do it personally. I do have a couple of studies actually running now on out-of-body experiences, one by Josephine is in the audience. So if you've had an OBE, we were interested to learn more about that and how it might have affected you, because it can have quite long-lasting impacts having an OBE. It can really affect somebody afterwards. Yeah, so do let me know if you'd like to take part.
Thanks, Jane. Beautiful, elegant studies. So I'm a complete novice to all of this, but I was interested in the out-of-body stuff. So when you're doing the virtual reality analysis, is there any evidence to suggest with repeat exposures that the self adapts to this over time?
Yeah. Well, they did some wild experiments, you might have heard of, with prisms, where you walk around and you see the whole world flipped upside down, and you feel really awful for a few days, but then eventually your brain kind of figures it out and flips it all back the wrong way again. So I have heard of one, I think a Japanese researcher, you wouldn't get the ethics in this country, and he spent several days wearing a virtual reality headset. Yeah, and you can imagine if you wear it for that long, he felt very, very long-lasting effects. I mean, that is an important thing to know about where we're trying to apply it, for example, for pain. So this is one thing we would have to check in our next project is if you have repeated exposure to these illusions, might the effect kind of lessen over time? And that would be a problem. So yeah, that's a good question. We'll see.
Thank you, Jane. That was a really interesting discourse, and I'm a complete novice in this, but before I get to my question, many congratulations on your professorship, and it was well deserved. So if I interpret this right, and it's probably going to be completely wrong, the sense of self is very much determined sort of internally before there's any external stimuli. But isn't there a big effect on the self by the external stimuli that you experience throughout your life? So for example, it's very unlikely, but some people might say, oh, Chris, I think you're clever. That's never happened, but I hope that it does happen. And I might actually start believing that as my concept of self. So where does the external stimuli part fit into the definition of self and what you are? And is that the right way to even look at it?
Yeah, no, definitely the external senses, but also other people. So I'm looking at a really kind of simple pared down version of self, but what I think is the foundation, what is there once you're born, probably even before you're born, and then of course as a result of experiences of other people who, you know, partly define who you are in terms of your personality. Certainly all of that interacts, but I think the basic foundation are those maps of the body within the brain, and then the other stuff kind of comes, as you say, with life experience on top of it. But it's really early days in this research. There's really, you know, only the last kind of 15, 20 years people have been really looking at this in any kind of depth. So there's so many questions, yeah, to answer.
Any more questions? Yes, please. So one there and one down here.
Thank you so much for a very, very interesting presentation. I'm curious about traumatic brain injury in cases of people who have permanent memory loss. And the last video of the lady who, on hearing the music, is this better?
Mm-hmm.
On hearing the music, she was able to relive her memory of herself and her ballet career. Could there be applications of that to helping people with memory loss in traumatic brain injury? I mean, I'm also thinking of conditioning in terms of associations of certain music with certain cognitive or motor activities, but that's my question in general.
Sorry, it's a bit difficult to hear what you're saying. Would which thing help with memory?
So when seeing the lady with memory loss come alive when she heard the ballet,
Oh yes, yeah.
and have her memories restored
Yeah.
through music, I'm asking if there could be applications of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No, I really think so. We have at AIU Institute of Musical Therapy, and I think they do some work with people with dementia. And you might have seen it on TV or something. You know, you have people who are just sitting, they're not responsive, they're not talking, and you play them some music from their youth, and they remember all the words. And yeah, music in particular, even if you aren't, you know, any kind of ballerina or musician, it seems to really endure in the brain even after the memories have disappeared. And I think what I was saying about the bodily self still sort of persisting even in those late stages of dementia, I think the application of that, I think one problem is often in dementia, you know, people are in a residential care home, they're in a place they're not familiar with, they're in a room they've never interacted with. If you can somehow maintain some of those sort of familiar objects and familiar music, you can somehow allow that remnants of self to kind of manifest again. So I think, yeah, there's definitely, and using music is something we should really, really look more into in research, yeah.
Just one more question down here, and then, sorry, down here. Okay, can we have two more then, and the final one down here for that? Is it a long night?
Oh, that's pretty loud. So mine's kind of similar to the lady in front of me who asked about memory.
Sorry, I can't hear.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
So mine's kind of similar with the question about trauma and memory. So I have more of a question because you said, from my understanding, how memory is also like a major thing when it comes to self. So I was just wondering if you'd done any like more studies on trauma from childhood and loss of memory and how that might affect self.
Mm-hmm. I haven't personally. I have done some research on depersonalization disorder. You might have heard of. So that is a sort of a disorder of self, which is, we think, usually triggered by trauma. And it causes people to feel a kind of a detachment from their self. So there is work looking at the effects of trauma on the self, and of course trauma can also cause things like PTSD, so problems in memory processing as well. So the only work I've done has been on depersonalization disorder and some of this recent PhD work where we're trying to look at interactions between memory and the bodily self. Yeah.
And then just down here, on this, sorry, I happen to walk around so much this evening. Jane will be around for a bit afterwards, so I'm sure we'll be really happy to take some things here.
Hiya, thank you. It was a really lovely lecture. I mean, very similar to the last question, actually. It's just, the study, and when you were talking about dissociation or just, body disconnection to mind and then illusion. You talk about different things, but not trauma, actually. And trauma is people with trauma because they get into survival mode, and then the body and mind disconnect, actually. And then people, actually, they can see themselves from above to down. And then I was wondering if, similar to the last question, actually, was if any research has been done to research the effects of trauma on this body and the mind disconnection.
Yeah.
And especially when you're talking about, interoception and how this is really we are, the kind of mind is connected, self is connected to interoception, and there is Dr. Porges done quite a lot of research on that, the polyvagal theory. And I mean, this is very much also traumatized people, very connected to your research, I believe. And I don't know if any research has been done by you.
Yeah, it's quite a new area of research. I haven't, again, done it myself. I've done some work on depersonalization disorder, which is usually triggered by trauma. And we've tried to look at some possible ways of helping people with those kind of conditions, because it's really difficult to treat. And yeah, often people who have had trauma, they often talk about, as you said, a disconnection from their body, of feeling sort of numb, of not feeling those sensations. So it might be that some of these, we're hoping that some of these techniques, so interoception can be trained. So even if you become sort of disconnected from those bodily sensations, there are ways now that we're developing of, in a sense, kind of reconnecting people with their body. So this is something, yeah, that is definitely starting to be researched, and I've done a little bit of work on that in my lab as well. Thanks.
So thanks everyone for your questions, and Jane, thanks for your generosity and in responding after such a fantastic lecture. I think I'm going to hand over to Professor Lauren Butler again for a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Well, I mean, how do you sum that up? I guess that is my job to try and do that. Jane, I mean, just what a fantastic talk that was. I mean, such elegant data, really, really, impressive and sort of mind-blowing data. And I think it speaks to the way in which you work, that so much of that is in collaboration with PhD students, with undergraduate students. I think it's like almost a sort of a best example of kind of how you work with others to do really, truly world-class research. I was really taken by the fact that where you started off was with sort of curiosity-driven research. You had some really, really great questions using some brilliantly novel paradigms. I've seen that paradigm, the out-of-body virtual experience paradigm before, and it's one of those paradigms you look at and you go, Christ, why didn't I come up with that? And it's because I'm just not good enough. But that is just a brilliant, brilliant paradigm. So I thought the way that led on then to clinical applications is just such, just fantastic work. I was reflecting as well, so, a number of those labs that you've worked in, probably all of those labs you've worked in. I'm a psychologist by background. I've heard of most of those. I know the names of some of those researchers, and they are leading labs in the world. And I can pay you no greater compliment than saying that what you've established, or nearly 20 years later, I think is one of the leading labs in the world in this area. It's absolutely fantastic research. So, just in summary, I mean, we are so proud to have you as a researcher, collaborator, and as a colleague here at ARU, and I very much look forward to the next decade and more to see where your research goes next. But on behalf of all of us here at ARU, just a very small token of our appreciation. So thank you, Jane. There we go. So I'm never one to keep anyone from a glass of wine and a bit of a natter. So I do believe Jane will be staying on afterwards for a little while. So please do join us for a glass of wine and an opportunity to ask Jane more questions. And if you are on your way home, then please do have a safe trip home. And we hope to see you again at ARU in the very near future. Thank you all very much and good night.